The dusty streets of Canyon Ridge buzzed with excitement as townspeople gathered around the courthouse steps. Two young Apache women stood on the wooden platform, their hands bound behind their backs, dark eyes scanning the hostile crowd below. Sarah and Maria Crowfeather, sisters barely past 20, had been accused of stealing horses from the wealthy rancher Vincent Morrison. The evidence seemed clear to the all-white jury. The horses were found near their family's small camp, and Morrison's foreman had sworn he saw them leading the animals away under cover of darkness. Sheriff Tom Bradley adjusted his hat nervously as he read the death sentence aloud. The crowd cheered, their bloodthirsty voices echoing off the adobe buildings that lined the main street. Most folks in Canyon Ridge had never liked having Apache families living so close to town. Even though these particular natives had always been peaceful, trading their beautiful hand-woven blankets and pottery for supplies they needed to survive. From his position leaning against the saloon wall, Jake Sidewinder McKenna watched the proceedings with growing unease. The notorious outlaw had ridden into Canyon Ridge 3 days earlier, planning to rob the bank before moving on to his next target. But something about this whole situation didn't sit right with him. McKenna had been running from the law for 5 years now, ever since he'd killed a corrupt sheriff who had murdered his younger brother in cold blood. He knew injustice when he saw it, and this felt wrong in every possible way. The hangman tested his rope while the crowd pressed closer to the platform. Children stood on wooden crates to get a better view, their parents holding them steady with calloused hands. McKenna studied the faces around him. Ranch hands, shopkeepers, farmers, and drifters who had come to town for supplies. Most wore expressions of grim satisfaction, as if watching these two young women die would somehow make their own hard lives easier to bear. McKenna's sharp green eyes caught something the others missed. Vincent Morrison stood near the front of the crowd, but instead of looking satisfied about getting justice for his stolen horses, the rancher appeared nervous and kept glancing toward a well-dressed stranger in an expensive black suit. The stranger had arrived in town the same day as McKenna, riding in a fancy carriage with 2 armed guards. Nobody seemed to know who he was, but he carried himself like a man used to getting his way. As the sisters were positioned over the trapdoors, Sarah Crowfeather lifted her chin defiantly and spoke in clear English to the crowd. She declared their innocence once more, explaining that they had been gathering medicinal herbs in the mountains when the horses were supposedly stolen. Her sister Maria nodded in agreement, tears streaming down her face but her voice steady as she added that they had never taken anything that didn't belong to them. The sheriff raised his hand to signal the hangman, but McKenna found himself stepping forward. His weathered hand rested on the grip of his Colt revolver as he called out in a voice that carried across the entire square. He told the crowd to wait, that something about this whole trial stunk worse than a dead skunk in August heat. People turned to stare at the tall, lean stranger with the sun-bleached hair and dangerous reputation written across his scarred face. Sheriff Bradley recognized McKenna immediately from the wanted posters that had been circulating for months. The outlaw had a bounty of $2,000 on his head, enough money to keep a lawman comfortable for years. But something in McKenna's eyes made the sheriff hesitate before reaching for his gun. This wasn't a man looking for a fight. This was someone who had seen enough injustice to know it when it stared him in the face. Morrison pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger as he demanded that the hanging proceed immediately. He shouted that McKenna was just another criminal trying to cause trouble, that the Apache sisters had been fairly tried and convicted by a proper jury. But McKenna had spent enough time reading people to survive as an outlaw, and Morrison's nervous energy told a different story than his angry words. The mysterious stranger in the black suit whispered something urgent in Morrison's ear, causing the rancher to pale visibly. McKenna caught the exchange and felt his suspicions deepen. He announced to the crowd that he was calling for a delay, that new evidence might come to light if people were willing to listen. The townspeople murmured among themselves, torn between their desire for vengeance and their curiosity about what the notorious outlaw might have discovered. As McKenna stepped closer to the platform, Sarah Crowfeather met his eyes with a mixture of hope and desperation. She had heard stories about Sidewinder McKenna, how he only robbed from corrupt officials and wealthy men who cheated poor folks out of their land. Some said he was just another killer, but others claimed he had a code of honor that most lawmen lacked. In that moment, with the noose casting shadows across her face, Sarah decided to trust this dangerous stranger who might be their only chance at survival. McKenna raised his voice above the murmuring crowd, demanding to know why Morrison was in such a hurry to see these women hang. The outlaw pointed out that most horse thieves got prison time or a good whipping, not death sentences. He asked why two young Apache women who had never caused trouble before would suddenly risk their lives stealing horses when they could barely afford to feed themselves. The questions hung in the hot desert air like smoke from a campfire. Sheriff Bradley found himself caught between his duty to uphold the law and his growing doubts about the case. The trial had been rushed through in just 2 days, which was unusual even for a frontier town where justice moved fast. Most folks had been so eager to see the Apache sisters punished that nobody had bothered asking hard questions about the evidence. Bradley had been sheriff for 8 years, and something about this whole situation felt orchestrated rather than natural. The stranger in the black suit stepped forward and introduced himself as Judge Harrison Caldwell from the territorial capital. He claimed to have been sent to observe local law enforcement and ensure that justice was being carried out properly. Caldwell's smooth voice carried authority as he insisted that the trial had been conducted fairly and that any delay would only encourage other criminals to question the legal system. But McKenna noticed how Caldwell's expensive gold watch chain caught the sunlight and how his soft hands had never done an honest day's work. McKenna decided to take a calculated risk. He announced that he had been watching the Morrison ranch for 3 days, planning to steal horses for himself, when he witnessed something that would interest everyone present. The crowd leaned forward eagerly, hungry for any new drama to spice up their routine lives. Morrison's face went white as fresh snow, and he started backing toward his horse, but several townspeople blocked his path without realizing they were doing it. The outlaw explained that on the night the horses supposedly went missing, he had seen Morrison himself leading a group of animals toward the Apache camp under cover of darkness. But Morrison hadn't been alone. 3 men McKenna didn't recognize had been with him, and they had been carrying surveying equipment and official-looking papers. After hiding the horses near the camp, Morrison and his companions had ridden back toward town, leaving a clear trail that any decent tracker could follow. Judge Caldwell interrupted sharply, claiming that McKenna was obviously lying to save his own criminal hide. The judge reminded the crowd that McKenna was a wanted man with a price on his head, that his word couldn't be trusted against that of respectable citizens like Morrison. Several people in the crowd nodded in agreement, but others looked uncertain. They had known Morrison for years, and while he was wealthy and sometimes arrogant, he had never seemed like the type to frame innocent people for crimes. Sarah Crowfeather spoke up from the platform, her voice carrying clearly across the square. She told the crowd that her grandfather had been a tracker for the army, and that he had taught her and Maria to read signs in the earth that most people couldn't see. On the morning they were arrested, she had noticed fresh horse tracks leading from Morrison's direction toward their camp, but the sheriff hadn't been interested in hearing about tracks made by Apache women. McKenna pulled out a leather pouch from his saddlebags and dumped its contents on a nearby barrel. Mixed in with his usual gear were several brass survey markers, the kind used by railroad companies and mining operations to mark property boundaries. He explained that he had picked these up near the Apache camp after Morrison and his mysterious companions had left. The markers bore the stamp of the Rocky Mountain Railroad Company, which had been trying to buy land throughout the territory for a new rail line. The crowd buzzed with excitement and confusion as people tried to understand what railroad markers had to do with stolen horses. McKenna spelled it out for them in simple terms that even the dullest person could grasp. Someone wanted the Apache families off their traditional camping ground, probably because valuable minerals had been discovered there, or because the railroad needed that exact piece of land for their tracks. Framing the sisters for horse theft was just a convenient way to get rid of them and scare other Apache families away from the area. Judge Caldwell's face had turned red with anger, and he demanded that Sheriff Bradley arrest McKenna immediately for interfering with legal proceedings. But the sheriff was studying those brass markers with growing interest, remembering that Morrison had been asking a lot of questions lately about Apache land rights and territorial laws. Bradley was an honest man who had gotten into law enforcement to protect people, not to help rich folks steal land from poor families. Morrison finally found his voice and started shouting that McKenna was making everything up, that the markers could have come from anywhere. But his protests sounded desperate rather than convincing, especially when several townspeople pointed out that Morrison had recently been seen talking to railroad men in the saloon. The wealthy rancher's usual confidence had cracked, revealing the scared and guilty man underneath. His arrogant exterior. McKenna pressed his advantage by asking Morrison to explain why he had been so eager to see the sisters hang immediately instead of letting them serve prison time. He pointed out that dead women couldn't tell their side of the story or point out inconsistencies in the evidence against them. The outlaw's words hit their target, and Morrison started stammering about justice and protecting the community. But his explanations rang hollow in the tense afternoon air. Young Maria Crowfeather added her own testimony, explaining that railroad men had visited their camp 2 weeks earlier, offering money for the Apache families to move further west. When the tribal elders had refused, saying the land held sacred meaning for their people, the railroad men had left angry and making threats. She had told this to the sheriff when they were arrested, but he had dismissed it as lies meant to confuse the issue. The tension in the town square grew thicker than molasses as people began choosing sides. Some townspeople still believed Morrison and wanted to proceed with the hanging, while others demanded a proper investigation into McKenna's claims. Sheriff Bradley found himself at the center of a brewing storm, knowing that whatever decision he made would change Canyon Ridge forever. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he considered the evidence piling up against the original story. Judge Caldwell tried to regain control of the situation by declaring that territorial law required the hanging to proceed as scheduled. He pulled out official papers and began reading legal language that most folks didn't understand, but his nervous voice betrayed his growing desperation. McKenna noticed how Caldwell kept glancing toward the edge of town, as if expecting someone to arrive and help him out of this increasingly difficult situation. Morrison's foreman, Pete Daniels, pushed through the crowd and announced that he stood by his original testimony. Daniels was a hard man with cold eyes who had worked for Morrison for 5 years, earning a reputation for using his fists to solve problems. He claimed that he had seen the Apache sisters with his own eyes leading the stolen horses away from the ranch, and that no amount of fancy talk from a wanted criminal would change what he had witnessed. But McKenna had been watching Daniels carefully during the original trial, and something about the foreman's story had never made sense. The outlaw asked Daniels to describe exactly what he had seen, pressing for details about the time of night, the weather conditions, and which direction the sisters had supposedly gone. As Daniels answered, his story began falling apart like a house of cards in a strong wind. Sarah Crowfeather spoke up again, pointing out that the night in question had been during the new moon, when darkness was so complete that even someone familiar with the land would have trouble seeing clearly. She asked how Daniels could have identified them specifically when they looked similar to many other Apache women in the area. Her sharp questions exposed holes in Daniels' testimony that should have been obvious. During the original trial, the crowd began murmuring more loudly as people realized they might have been rushing toward a terrible mistake. Old Martha Henderson, who ran the general store, called out that she remembered Daniels being in her shop that same evening, buying supplies and complaining about having to work late. If Daniels had been in town during the supposed theft, how could he have witnessed it happening 20 miles away at the ranch? McKenna sensed the mood shifting and decided to reveal another piece of information he had been holding back. He explained that during his surveillance of the Morrison ranch, he had overheard a conversation between Morrison and 3 strangers about making the Apache problem disappear permanently. The men had discussed how a few strategic deaths would send a message to other tribes about staying away from valuable land. Judge Caldwell's composure finally cracked, completely as he realized his carefully planned scheme was unraveling in front of dozens of witnesses. He began backing toward his fancy carriage, while insisting that McKenna was a dangerous criminal whose word meant nothing. But his retreat only made him look more guilty, and several townspeople moved to block his escape route without being asked. Morrison made a desperate play by offering a $1,000 reward to anyone who would arrest McKenna on the spot. The outlaw's bounty was already worth $2,000, making him an extremely valuable prize for anyone brave enough or foolish enough to try capturing him. Several men in the crowd fingered their weapons nervously, torn between their growing doubts about the hanging and their desire for easy money. But McKenna had spent years staying alive by reading dangerous situations correctly. He could see that most of the crowd was now on his side, angry at being manipulated and lied to by men they had trusted. The outlaw kept his hand near his gun but didn't draw it, knowing that violence would only complicate things and possibly get innocent people hurt in the crossfire. Sheriff Bradley made his decision and stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice was steady but heavy with regret as he announced that the hanging would be postponed until a proper investigation could be conducted. He explained that too many questions had been raised to proceed with executions, and that his duty was to seek truth rather than rush to judgment. The sisters on the platform sagged with relief, though they remained cautious about celebrating too early. They had lived as minorities in a hostile territory long enough to know that justice could be snatched away as quickly as it was offered. Sarah caught McKenna's eye and nodded slightly, acknowledging that this dangerous stranger had given them something precious, time to prove their innocence. Caldwell finally reached his carriage and began climbing inside, but McKenna called out for everyone to wait. The outlaw had noticed something important about the judge's transportation that he wanted the crowd to see. The carriage bore the same railroad company markings as the brass survey tools, and the armed guards wore badges, identifying them as railroad security rather than territorial marshals. This revelation sent a shockwave through the gathered townspeople as they realized how deep the conspiracy actually went. A fake judge, backed by railroad money and muscle, had come to their town to ensure that 2 innocent women died for a crime they didn't commit. The scope of the deception made people angry in a way that simple horse theft never could have managed. Morrison saw his carefully constructed plan falling apart and made a run for his horse, but the crowd was ready for him. 3 ranch hands who had worked for him for years tackled Morrison before he could reach his mount, their loyalty evaporating once they understood how he had used them in his scheme. Pete Daniels tried to help his boss escape but found himself surrounded by angry townspeople who had trusted his false testimony. With Morrison and Daniels restrained by angry townspeople, Sheriff Bradley moved quickly to secure Judge Caldwell before he could escape in his carriage. The fake judge's armed guards reached for their weapons, but they found themselves facing dozens of armed citizens who were furious about being deceived. Realizing they were outnumbered and outgunned, the guards slowly raised their hands in surrender, their loyalty to the railroad company not extending to dying for it. McKenna used the chaos to climb onto the hanging platform and cut the ropes binding the Crow Feather sisters. Sarah rubbed her wrists gratefully while Maria collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of their fortunes. The outlaw helped both women down from the platform, noting how the crowd's attitude toward them had completely changed, now that people understood they were victims rather than criminals. Sheriff Bradley began searching Caldwell's carriage and found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Hidden in a secret compartment were detailed maps of Apache lands, geological surveys indicating valuable copper deposits, and correspondence between the railroad company and various territorial officials. The letters revealed a systematic plan to remove Apache families from their traditional lands through false accusations, intimidation, and, if necessary, executions. The most damning document was a letter signed by Caldwell himself, outlining the specific plan to frame the Crow Feather sisters for horse theft. The letter explained that their deaths would serve as an example to other Apache families, encouraging them to accept railroad buyout offers rather than risk similar fates. The cold, calculated nature of the scheme shocked even hardened frontier folks who were used to violence and injustice. Morrison finally broke down under the weight of evidence against him and began confessing everything. He revealed that the railroad company had approached him months earlier with an offer he couldn't refuse, $50,000 to help them acquire Apache lands through legal manipulation. His own ranch was heavily in debt, and the railroad money represented his only chance to avoid bankruptcy and disgrace. The rancher explained how the plan had been developed step by step. First, they would plant stolen horses near Apache camps and arrange for witnesses to identify specific individuals as thieves. Then Caldwell would arrive posing as a territorial judge to ensure that harsh sentences were imposed quickly, before anyone could investigate too thoroughly. The goal was to eliminate tribal leaders and create enough fear to drive the remaining families away from valuable land. Pete Daniels, seeing his boss confessing everything, decided to save himself by providing additional details about the conspiracy. He revealed that this wasn't the first time the railroad company had used such tactics, and that similar schemes had been employed in other territories to acquire land for rail lines and mining operations. The scope of the criminal enterprise extended far beyond Canyon Ridge. McKenna found himself in an unusual position as the crowd began looking to him for leadership. The notorious outlaw had become an unlikely hero by exposing the conspiracy, but he knew that his own wanted status made him a liability for the townspeople. He advised Sheriff Bradley to contact federal marshals immediately, as the case involved multiple territories and federal crimes that local law enforcement couldn't handle alone. Sarah Crowfeather approached McKenna with tears in her eyes, thanking him for saving their lives when he had nothing to gain from helping them. She explained that her people had legends about unlikely warriors who appeared in times of great need, and that she believed McKenna was fulfilling such a role, whether he realized it or not. Her words touched something deep inside the hardened outlaw that he thought had died years ago. The crowd began demanding immediate justice for Morrison, Caldwell, and their accomplices. Some people called for a hanging, wanting to use the same gallows that had been prepared for the innocent sisters. Others suggested tarring and feathering, or running the conspirators out of town on rails. The anger was understandable, but McKenna recognized that mob justice would only create more problems in the long run. Sheriff Bradley managed to restore order by promising that proper legal proceedings would be followed. He explained that the evidence was strong enough to ensure convictions in a real court, and that rushing to judgment would make them no better than the conspirators who had tried to railroad the Apache sisters. His words carried weight because people respected his integrity and his willingness to admit he had been deceived. As the immediate crisis passed, McKenna began thinking about his own situation. He had revealed himself to save 2 innocent lives, but that meant his location was now known to dozens of people. Word would spread quickly about his presence in Canyon Ridge, and bounty hunters or federal marshals would arrive within days. The outlaw knew he would have to leave town soon, but something kept him from mounting his horse and riding away immediately. Maria Crowfeather had been quiet during most of the confrontation, but now she approached McKenna with a proposal that surprised everyone present. She explained that her people had ancient rights to travel and camp throughout the territory, rights that predated railroad claims and territorial laws. If McKenna would help them gather evidence about other railroad conspiracies, they could provide him with safe passage through Apache lands where federal marshals couldn't follow. The offer intrigued McKenna because it represented something he had never had before: allies who shared his desire for justice and his opposition to corrupt authority. For 5 years he had been running alone, fighting a personal war against the system that had killed his brother. Now he had a chance to be part of something larger, to help protect people who couldn't protect themselves from powerful interests. Sheriff Bradley approached the group and made his own surprising announcement. He revealed that he had been corresponding with federal authorities about corruption in the territorial government, and that McKenna's actions had provided exactly the kind of evidence needed to launch a major investigation. The sheriff offered to put in a good word with federal marshals, suggesting that McKenna's cooperation in exposing the railroad conspiracy might earn him some consideration regarding his own legal troubles. 3 days after the confrontation in the town square, McKenna found himself in an abandoned mining camp 20 miles east of Canyon Ridge, meeting with Federal Marshal John Patterson and 2 Apache tribal elders. The outlaw had agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for protection from bounty hunters, while he helped expose the full extent of the railroad conspiracy. Patterson was a tall, serious man who had spent 15 years fighting corruption in territorial governments. The evidence collected from Caldwell's carriage had revealed connections to similar schemes in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona territories. The Rocky Mountain Railroad Company had been systematically targeting Native American communities, small ranchers, and anyone else who stood in the way of their expansion plans. Federal authorities estimated that hundreds of people had been displaced or killed as part of these illegal land grabs. Sarah and Maria Crowfeather had become key witnesses in the federal case, providing detailed testimony about railroad intimidation tactics and helping investigators understand how the schemes worked from the victim's perspective. Their grandfather, Chief Joseph Crowfeather, had arrived with maps and documentation showing how railroad agents had been pressuring Apache families throughout the territory for months. McKenna's unique position as both an outlaw and a witness created complicated legal challenges for the federal investigators. Marshal Patterson explained that while McKenna's past crimes couldn't simply be forgotten, His cooperation in exposing the conspiracy had significant value. The federal government was willing to negotiate a deal that might reduce his sentence substantially if he continued. Helping with the investigation, the outlaw had mixed feelings about the possibility of redemption through legal channels. For 5 years, he had believed that the system was too corrupt to provide real justice, but the federal response to the railroad conspiracy was beginning to change his perspective. Perhaps there were still honest lawmen, willing to fight powerful interests when presented with sufficient evidence of wrongdoing. Chief Crowfeather shared information that shocked even the experienced federal marshal. The Apache leader revealed that railroad agents had been using a network of corrupt officials, fake judges, and hired gunmen to eliminate opposition throughout the Southwest. The conspiracy involved territorial governors, land office clerks, mining company executives, and even some federal employees who had been bought with railroad money. McKenna realized that his personal war against corruption had been just a small part of a much larger conflict. The system that had killed his brother was more extensive and better organized than he had ever imagined. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, the outlaw found himself energized by the possibility of striking a real blow against the forces that had destroyed so many lives. Marshal Patterson outlined a plan that would require McKenna to travel throughout the territory, gathering evidence and identifying other victims of railroad conspiracies. The work would be dangerous because railroad agents would be hunting for him, but it offered a chance to help bring down the entire criminal network. The federal government would provide him with some protection and legal immunity for crimes committed during the investigation. Sarah Crowfeather volunteered to accompany McKenna on his evidence-gathering mission, arguing that her knowledge of Apache lands and people would be invaluable. She also pointed out that traveling with a Native American woman would provide McKenna with cover, since bounty hunters would be looking for a lone white outlaw rather than a mixed couple. Her proposal made practical sense, but McKenna worried about putting her in danger. The investigation had already begun producing results back in Canyon Ridge. Sheriff Bradley had arrested 3 more railroad agents who had been operating in the area, and territorial authorities were reviewing dozens of suspicious land transfers and court decisions. Morrison remained in custody, and his detailed confessions were helping investigators understand how the conspiracy had been organized and funded. Judge Caldwell, meanwhile, had been revealed as a complete fraud with no legal authority whatsoever. His real name was Harrison Booth, and he was a former lawyer who had been disbarred for corruption in Kansas before being hired by the railroad company to pose as a territorial judge. The depth of the deception amazed everyone involved in the case. McKenna spent long hours discussing strategy with the federal marshal and Apache leaders, planning how to approach other potential victims and gather evidence safely. The work would require him to pose as different types of people, sometimes a drifter looking for work, other times a land speculator or mining investor. His natural ability to read people and situations would be crucial for success. The outlaw also had to confront his own motivations for accepting this dangerous assignment. Part of him was driven by a desire for revenge against the system that had wronged him, but another part genuinely wanted to help innocent people avoid the fate that had befallen the Crowfeather sisters. Perhaps redemption was possible not through avoiding consequences for his past actions, but through using his skills to protect others. As the meeting concluded, Chief Crowfeather performed a traditional blessing ceremony for McKenna and Sarah, asking the spirits to protect them during their dangerous journey. The old Apache leader explained that their mission was about more than gathering evidence. It was about restoring balance between those who took everything and those who gave freely. Marshal Patterson provided McKenna with official documents, identifying him as a federal informant, papers that would offer some protection if he was captured by local law enforcement. The marshal also gave him a special badge that could be shown to trusted federal agents in emergency situations. These credentials represented the first time in 5 years that McKenna had any legal standing whatsoever. Sarah packed supplies for their journey while McKenna cleaned and checked his weapons. They would be traveling light and fast, avoiding main roads and staying in Apache camps whenever possible. The mission would take them through some of the most dangerous territory in the Southwest, where railroad agents, hostile tribes, and natural hazards all posed serious threats. 6 months after their dangerous mission began, McKenna and Sarah had gathered enough evidence to bring down the entire railroad conspiracy. Their travels had taken them through 4 territories, where they documented dozens of illegal land grabs, false imprisonments, and murders committed by railroad agents. The evidence they collected led to the arrest of 53 people, including 2 territorial governors and a federal land office director. The final confrontation came in Santa Fe, where the head of the Rocky Mountain Railroad Company, Marcus Blackwood, was finally arrested by federal marshals. Blackwood had been orchestrating the land grab schemes from his luxurious office, believing himself untouchable because of his political connections and vast wealth. When McKenna and Sarah presented their evidence to a federal grand jury, Blackwood's empire of corruption crumbled within days. McKenna's cooperation with federal authorities had earned him something he never expected: a presidential pardon for his past crimes. President Hayes personally signed the document, citing McKenna's heroic efforts to expose corruption and protect innocent citizens. The former outlaw found himself transformed from a wanted criminal into a federal deputy marshal, with authority to investigate territorial crimes throughout the Southwest. Sarah Crow Feather had become a respected advocate for Native American rights, working with federal authorities to ensure that stolen lands were returned to their rightful owners. Her testimony before Congress had led to new laws protecting tribal lands from fraudulent acquisition, and she had been appointed as a special liaison between the federal government and Apache communities throughout the region. The partnership between McKenna and Sarah had evolved into something deeper than professional cooperation. They had fallen in love during their dangerous travels, finding in each other the understanding and acceptance that both had been searching for. Their wedding was performed by Chief Crow Feather in a traditional Apache ceremony that symbolized the joining of 2 different worlds for a common purpose. Canyon Ridge had become a symbol of how ordinary people could stand up against powerful interests when they worked together. Sheriff Bradley was elected mayor of the growing town, which had attracted new settlers who were drawn by stories of justice prevailing over corruption. The hanging platform where the Crow Feather sisters had nearly died was torn down and replaced with a memorial to all victims of railroad violence. Morrison and his accomplices received long prison sentences in federal court, where their crimes were prosecuted under new laws designed to prevent corporate conspiracies against Native Americans. Pete Daniels testified against his former allies in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing crucial details about how railroad agents recruited local criminals to carry out their schemes. The fake judge Harrison Booth received the harshest sentence of all the conspirators, spending the rest of his life in federal prison for impersonating a territorial official and participating in attempted murder. His conviction sent a clear message to other corrupt individuals that federal authorities would pursue justice regardless of how powerful or well-connected the criminals believed themselves to be. McKenna's transformation from outlaw to lawman had been complete, but he never forgot the lessons learned during his years outside the legal system. As a federal deputy, he made special efforts to investigate claims of injustice from people who might otherwise be ignored by authorities. His unique background helped him understand how corruption worked and how to gather evidence against powerful criminals. The Apache communities throughout the Southwest had regained much of their stolen land through federal court decisions based on evidence gathered by McKenna and Sarah. Chief Crow Feather lived to see his people's sacred sites protected by federal law, and he often said that the spirits had guided McKenna to Canyon Ridge at exactly the right moment to prevent a great tragedy. Years later, when McKenna and Sarah had children of their own, they would tell them stories about how justice sometimes comes from unexpected places. They explained that heroes aren't always the people wearing badges or sitting in government offices, but often ordinary individuals who choose to do the right thing when it matters most. The Rocky Mountain Railroad Company was forced to pay millions of dollars in compensation to victims of their illegal schemes, money that was used to build schools and hospitals in Apache communities throughout the territory. The company's executives faced criminal prosecution, and several spent years in federal prison for their roles in the conspiracy. McKenna kept his federal deputy badge until the day he died, but he was most proud of a simple Apache bracelet that Sarah had woven for him during their first mission together. The bracelet reminded him that redemption was possible for anyone willing to fight for justice, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns but with courage and determination. The story of the Canyon Ridge conspiracy became legendary throughout the Southwest, inspiring other communities to stand up against corruption and injustice. Federal authorities used the case as a model for investigating corporate crimes, and law schools taught courses about how ordinary citizens could work with federal agents to expose criminal conspiracies. In the end, two Apache sisters who had faced death for a crime they didn't commit became symbols of how the innocent could find justice when good people refused to stand by and watch evil triumph. Their near execution had been prevented by an outlaw who discovered that true redemption comes not from running away from responsibility, but from using whatever skills one possesses to protect those who cannot protect themselves.